So there I sat on a hot summer's day in 1993, sand dunes stretching to the horizon. The wind tugged at my hat and scarf. I was dressed pretty much like that. You see me here at Merowe in Sudan. Sweat dripped down my face as I frantically worked on the critical translation that would allow our project to continue. The thermometer topped 120 degrees in the shade. It was really hot. Trying desperately to concentrate, I searched for the right phrase in my hieroglyphic dictionary. Finally, I found the words, and ready just in time for the shout of cameras rolling in action. Of course, I wasn't in the Nubian desert. I was in the desert in the Buttercup Dunes in the desert near Yuma, Arizona, working on the production Stargate. Little did I know that only 2 months after getting my Ph.D., I'd be working on a major motion picture, teaching actors how to speak ancient Egyptian, writing dialogue, commenting on the script, and assisting with sets and props. Like Heinlein's protagonist, also named Smith, and Moses before him, of course, I found myself a stranger in a strange land, immersed in a different world where reality and fantasy mixed into the hyperreal. So like a film script, I'll proceed in 4 acts and an epilogue. And here you see an example from the actual shooting script that I used on Stargate. You notice one copy is pink and the other is white. And one of the things I learned about film productions is that a script on a film is constantly evolving and changing. And so each different iteration of the script got a different color, and they would integrate it into my copy of the shooting script. And so it ends up looking a bit like a rainbow in the end. So it's kind of a moving target how these films evolve, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. So Act 1 explores how an Egyptologist, me, came to play such a central role in a big budget film, and how my work on Stargate helped to create a kind of hyper-real world blending Egyptology and science fiction. Act 2 begins a post-colonial turn, comparing the theme of ancient astronauts to 19th and 20th century diffusionist arguments. This has kind of come up before, most notably Petrie's dynastic race, but also the cognitive dissonance of a person of color, Dean Devlin, one of the producer writers, trying to mitigate racism in Hollywood while playing on those themes. Act 3 continues this post-colonial narrative by exploring the idea of the white savior in Stargate and the imperial Gothic. And Act 4 queers Stargate, exploring the ideas of transgression, atavism, and ambiguity, themes that also play a central role in the mummy genre. And in the epilogue, I'll return to the title, comparing my journey into a strange land with that of the film's protagonist, and even actor James Spader. And then finishing with a consideration of the film's impact and some of the topics we've been talking about over the course of the conference. So how did an academic end up working on a major motion picture as a newly minted PhD? It did help that I had plenty of time on my hands at that point. Proximity and fate played a role. So based at UCLA's Cookson Institute of Archaeology, I would often field questions from Hollywood productions about ancient Egypt. It comes up, as we've seen, quite a bit. Normally, these queries didn't amount to much, but one day, about a month after I filed, I got a call from a producer wanting the term Stargate and hieroglyphs for a teaser to sell the money people on a major film with the promise of a job as a consultant if it all worked out. It was easy enough to do and a bit of fun playing with my hieroglyphic font, so I worked up several ways to phrase it and sent it off, not really expecting to hear back. But within a month, I was brought onto the pre-production team for the film, consulting with props and set people and reviewing a copy of the script. Fortunately, a friend of mine, Gordon Smith, no relation, but a great guy, who was in the business, as one always has friends in LA who are in the business, offered to negotiate for me just to help me out for the fun of it, which was very cool of him and gave me a much needed influx of cash, as well as facilitating an amazing experience. But one of the best things about the film was that everybody called me Dr. Smith or Doc. It was, hey Doc, how you doing? Or Dr. Smith to set. It was very cool. And somehow very validating and about all that hard work that I'd done to get a dissertation, as many of you have experienced or will soon be experiencing. As an Egyptologist on a movie set, I was in many ways like Moses or Heinlein's Martian, raised human, a stranger in a strange land. I was technically home in California even, but at the same time in a very different place. I was there in large part due to writer-producer Dean Devlin and writer-director Roland Emmerich, who were serious about crafting a science fiction film and more than a bit fascinated by ancient Egypt. Like all good science fiction writers, they were dedicated to the principle of the suspension of disbelief. As a result, they wanted everything outside of the main conceit of the film, that ancient aliens inspired, the construction of pyramids and so on, to be as accurate as possible, in particular the reconstruction of spoken Egyptian. And I have to say, they were really great people to work with, and also very great people on the set overall. I've heard talking to people on set, some horror stories about dictatorial directors and jerky producers. There was even one kind of Uber producer who came onto the set, and I got a little taste of what that was like. And these guys ran a really great collegial and humane set, which I thought was pretty impressive. And they supported everything that I did, which was pretty amazing. So you're probably all familiar with the film, but a quick review of the plot might be helpful. So in the movie, Egyptologist Daniel Jackson, played by James Spader, travels with a military team led by Colonel O'Neill, played by Kurt Russell, through the Stargate, a strange alien artifact found near the Great Pyramid in the 1920s. And actually, I advised on this excavation thing quite a bit, that whole set of scenes, and I think actually presents a pretty convincing simulacrum of a sort of an excavation in Egypt in the 1930s. Certainly much better than the Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark excavation at Tanis. And I actually waved them away from a few things like those odd little platform things that they've got there, which you would never find. Anyway, back to Stargate. So it transports them across the universe to another planet where they encounter an alternative high-tech version of ancient Egypt with a culture of humans who speak a strangely familiar language. Eventually, Jackson realizes that they speak ancient Egyptian once he figures out the pronunciation. In a clever turn, the early dialogue is not subtitled, but the dialogue after Jackson figures it out is, putting the audience in the place of the protagonist. A few years later, another film, The 13th Warrior, adopted a similar conceit to simulate the protagonist's gradual understanding of a foreign language. For example, during one of the early unsubtitled scenes in Stargate, Jackson offers the local leader, Khasuf, you can see here looking backwards, a candy bar, and he says, Bani Way. And I think every Egyptologist immediately understood that Bani Way was a vocalization of the hieroglyphic string Benerwi. Of course, hieroglyphs don't have vowels, and I'll give you another example in a little bit. But it took Jackson a bit longer to comprehend. To be fair, he'd just been dragged across the desert, so I don't think he was really at his best. Reconstructing the vocalization involved taking into account the loss of the final R, a feature already appearing in late Egyptian, and inserting vowels and accent from what we know about the syllabic structure of ancient Egyptian. So you end up with Bani Way. Eventually, with the help of Jackson's linguistic skills, our heroes encourage and assist a native rebellion against a sinister space alien inhabiting a human body, played by Jay Davidson, posing as the sun god Re. Oh, and after the film came out, Bill and Renee came up to me and told me, oh, Bani Way, oh, that's wonderful. And he saw the homage to the late John Callender, who inspired much of the reconstructed dialogue in the film. Emmerich and writer-producer Devlin cared about the accuracy of everything outside of the film's Erich von Däniken-inspired science fiction premise, taking every note that I gave him, including crafting Egyptological babble for Jackson's character. They were especially enthusiastic about the language, even though only a few hundred of the millions who would see the film could tell the difference. Well, I think you can notice the difference because it is a real language. The stars certainly appreciated the fact that they were actually saying something real instead of made-up nonsense words, even though they probably thought that I was a bit of a pain sometimes, especially when it was 120 degrees. Everything you hear in the film is ancient Egyptian, about half of the movie's dialogue. Apart from translating dialogue and crafting a few hieroglyphic inscriptions when necessary, I spent a great deal of time with James Spader, helping not only with his dialogue, but also giving him insights into Egyptology and more broadly the life of an out-of-work recent Ph.D., which I was at that point, but without the crazy pyramid theories. As an anthropologist, I could appreciate the opportunity for some participant observation. A film crew is its own subculture, one that took me a bit of time to grok over the 3 months out of about a 5-month shoot I was on set. Making a film involves a complex hierarchy and dance of crew and talent coming together, only to break apart and reconfigure for the next project, a kind of nomadic existence, even within the context of a single shoot. And Stargate had its own share of rather strange experiences. So Sand sweepers were an integral part of the crew in the outdoor scenes, because in Hollywood, you constantly reshoot scenes from different angles to get just the right take. And so if you walked across a pristine dune, you leave footprints. You can't walk across it again with footprints there. So they had these people sweeping sand. They had giant fans out there to try and remove that. Also, one thing I had never realized about films is the use of smoke and dust. And this creates a sense of depth. So you don't get that with a normal camera. In order to do it, you have to put something in the air that gets that fade out kind of sense of depth and distance. And given the huge scale of the sets on Stargate, this was really critical. Probably not very healthy to breathe in, though. But most of the time, and then it truly was a cast of thousands, and this was fascinating to see, these big scenes with these massive crowds. Here you see the final kind of rebellion scene when the local people stage an uprising against the evil, sort of god Ra. Most of the time, I just sit around on set like everyone else who didn't have anything to do at that moment and raid the craft services table, which did not do much for my waistline, but was super tasty. Movie making is tremendously inefficient. A shot begins with the configuring of lights and sets and lighting, as you can see here, adding set decoration or props and furniture and those kinds of things. Makeup or touch up when the actors arrive. Then they shoot the scene or part of a scene. And here's how you can see how they cheated on the cast of thousands thing. They filmed 3 wedges to fill this area of the sand dune and then knitted them together. And so pretty fun to see these little movie magic things directly. But each shot gets shot multiple times, so they would sort of rinse and repeat as you went along. For me, with a minute or two to cameras rolling, Spader or someone like Jay Davidson, you see here, might come up with a new line that they needed or a little tweaking or whatever, and suddenly I'd have to come up with an instant translation or vocalization. I felt like an emergency response Egyptologist. A couple of times I got calls at 9 or 10 p.m. from a frantic assistant director or AD saying that the schedule had changed and someone has a line and can I please be on the 6 a.m. flight to Yuma? And that's kind of how the movie industry works. Either nothing's happening or it's a crisis. For example, at the beginning of the shoot, they said that I'd be in Yuma for a day or two, and I ended up staying for a couple of weeks. And I also got a few wild rides on dune buggies or rails, like you can see here, to whisk me off to some sand dune to feed some lines to actors. This, by the way, is the famous special effects artist Kit West, who was on the film. So it was really cool to see some of these people, practicing their craft. Work on the film is also an exercise in hyperreality, shifting from the real to simulation in the form of film sets and the Egyptian dialogue. I remember walking onto the set of the secret military base from the beginning of the film. It's really completely mundane apart from the big cover stones, but the rest of it just looks like a modern facility. But it was so convincing that it became a kind of alternate reality. I could walk through the corridors and imagine myself. In fact, I was placed into this other space. It was the same with the main street of the village on the distant planet. I actually had a lot to do with a lot of the detail on this, advising them on the look and so forth. But this whole street going up was this amazing giant set where you could literally have this immersive experience. Dean Devlin walked me through the encampment and up the side of, and up the side of a sand dune, saying he wanted to show me something cool. And when we crested the dune, this is what I saw. This amazing, ancient Egyptian temple buried in the sand. And this was full scale. It's like 8 stories tall, a really massive and incredible thing. I felt a bit like, Belzoni or Burckhardt from the so-called golden age of Egyptology and archaeology. Although it's important to remember that it was also the golden age of empires, very apropos, as I'll discuss later. Watching the masked Horuses and Anubises, and we just heard about these hybrid figures in a fascinating lecture. I wish I could have seen that exhibit. Were also mind-blowingly hyper-real. If you just looked at the figures, the actors standing in the mask with the backdrop like this, the masks were completely animated. The only thing that was CGI was the way they folded up and back. And so the heads moved, little feather thingies went up and down, the eyes might glow, and they really looked like they were alive. Of course, the actors were in them, but the mask itself looked like it was really a part of the actor. It was really amazing, as long as you didn't look over to the side and see the guys with their little joysticks moving everything around. But really, really an amazing experience. That really transported me to kind of another place and time. But I experienced the most profound hyperreality as I coached Eric Avari as Kasuf and Millie Avital as Shady in the pivotal scene where Jackson refuses to take advantage of the heroine and her father freaks out, thinking that she has insulted Ray's representative. I remember distinctly sitting kind of embedded in the set off to the side and having an epiphany, and ancient Egyptian really became a living language to me at that point. And here I will try and let's see. Okay, I'll try and see if this works and we can get sound, but I'll go ahead and play it. And I don't know if the sound will come through.
It's me. I want
So hopefully you were able to hear some of that sound. If not, you can always go back and revisit the film. But listening to my vocalized dialogue being spoken by actors with emotion and context, ancient Egyptian became, as I said, a living language to me. I could hear the music of it, the rhythms that are lost in the way Egyptologists normally pronounce ancient Egyptian. I was no stranger to vocalized Egyptian, but hearing the actors speaking in a normal pace with emotion and costume in the context of a scene and on an immersive set made it suddenly become real for me. Intellectually, I know it's an approximation, if based on solid evidence, but in a profound way, the language ceased to be a simulation of past reality and became a real living language to me, a real experience of hyperreality. Now, most Egyptologists ignore or downplay vocalization, which is not necessary for translation, the cartouche of Ramses II here, but is critical if one is interested in a more linguistic approach to the structure of the language. So anyone who's studied ancient Egyptian knows that the glyphs are primarily phonetic, providing a kind of consonantal skeleton of a word, but lacking vowels. So Egyptologists might pronounce this string of consonants as Ramses Mariamun, and each of these are little sentences, so they're little grammatical structures. Now, any reconstruction of ancient Egyptian begins with Coptic, which of course is still used in the Coptic Christian church, but the language itself has long since disappeared, replaced by Arabic, and you can see there are even Arabic annotations on this religious document. The Coptic is written in the Greek, in a kind of modified version of the Greek alphabet, and so does preserve vowels. Now, to project back farther into antiquity, you can use cuneiform text. Cuneiform is a syllabary, and so it also preserves vowels. And a number of names are written in cuneiform. And because the names are little sentences, you get the transcription of different words, but also conjugations of verbs and this kind of thing. And in fact, Ramses Mariamun appears in the Hittite archives. And here's how it's rendered in cuneiform, Ria Mashesha Mai Yamana. And so we can take that and go back to our consonantal skeleton and back to Coptic and reconstruct a very plausible transcription. So first we remove the W from Ra, which is the original spelling, but drops away quite early. We move the R from Mary, the word for beloved, just because of the particular grammatical construction here. And then insert the vowels, and we end up with Ria Masesa Mai Yamane. Interestingly enough, the name of Amun, Yamane, or Amane, is exactly the same as it's transcribed into Nubian and reflects the close ties between the Nubian version of Amani or Amun and the Egyptian one. So this is how we do it. It is an approximation, but it actually works very well and produces a much more sort of organic language than the rather staid Egyptological pronunciations. And I really think there's something lost in the way Egyptologists pronounce them. And studying with the students of the late John Callender and with Antonio Loprieno, I got a real sort of introduction to this topic. All the actors picked up on the language well, with the exception of Jay Davidson, who tried hard but struggled. And here you see the actors playing the young rebels, Skare and Nabe. maybe asked me to give them extra phrases and, of course, naughty words, and we're soon swearing at each other in Egyptian. You can barely hear it maybe sometimes in the background. And Eric Avari and Alexis Cruz, you see on the left here, whiled away the time talking in ancient Egyptian based on their dialogue and these extra materials I gave them, which is one of the reasons I think why the language comes out so beautifully in the film. As I said, Jay Davidson was the exception, and we ended up with one scene right here where he had a long string of dialogue and he just could not say the lines. And I couldn't imagine why this might have been the case, although we did notice this was always hanging around when Jay was there. Now, to be fair, Jay wasn't a professional actor and he was a recovering addict at the time, and of course still had some issues with addiction during the film. But I suddenly became the most important person on this film to get Jay to go through and say his lines. And I have to say, Jay really did try. I rehearsed with him extensively, and he really put effort into it, but he just panicked and froze whenever he had a line to say. At one point, we had a little receiver in my ear, and they were, feeding the lines directly to him from a little improvised sound booth, but that didn't work, and so we ended up with cue cards. Some of the strangest cue cards, I think, that Hollywood has ever seen. And what I would do is pronounce the line to Jay. He would write it out because, of course, he speaks British English. And so we ended up with a kind of British version of my transcriptions, and that got him through the film. One thing I couldn't change, of course, was the ancient aliens theme, inspired by Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. And again, we've heard about this already in the conference as well. This dynamic, Sean Manning has already talked about the particular appeal of ancient astronauts to film, and this dynamic definitely played out in the conception of Stargate. Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin were fascinated by both ancient Egypt and the literally outlandish theory that ancient astronauts were responsible for the achievements of ancient peoples, in particular monuments like the Great Pyramids of Giza. The theme easily translates into a science fiction conceit that allowed for both a clever premise and sumptuous visuals. So you have the alien pyramid spaceship landing on pyramids. It also plays on long-standing biases in the West among both scholars and the general public about Egypt and more broadly non-Western societies. The attempt to disassociate Egypt from its African context goes back to Knott and Gliddon's Types of Mankind from 1854, and more generally the Hamitic hypothesis. For Knott and Gliddon, the so-called scientific system of racial ranking could not be maintained with dark-skinned Africans creating an ancient civilization like Egypt. So they insisted that a master Caucasoid race must have come from Western Asia to create an ancient Egyptian civilization and dominate the original Negroid population, a model that conveniently naturalized American slavery. And this is only 6 years before the Civil War. Their views resonated with the newly minted version of the Hamitic myth that removed the older idea of a cursed dark-skinned African group and emphasized the Hamites as Caucasoid origins, connecting Egypt and even Nubia to Western Asia, as you can see in this map here from a German publication. As late as the mid-20th century, Seligman continued to insist that, and I quote, "the civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites, pastoral Europeans arriving wave after wave, better armed as well as quicker-witted than the dark agricultural Negroes." Sadly, these same attitudes about ancient Egypt's non-African origins remain in an implicit Egyptological tendency to divorce Egypt from Africa. This unscientific notion has even been taken up uncritically in DNA studies by hard scientists who are apparently oblivious to the dark history of Egyptology's connection to the emergence of scientific racism. In the end, von Däniken's theory is the most extreme expression of the diffusionist and migrationist models of the 19th and early 20th centuries, like Petrie's dynastic race, which has already been discussed a bit. These served colonial and racist agendas by explaining away the accomplishments of peoples that were coming under colonial rule by white European and American empires. Unlike his successors, Emery and Derry, who, like Salaam, were still publishing in the 50s and 60s, Petrie's conception was more subtle. Rather than a singular migration of a master race, as in their formulations, Petrie allows for admixture and explains later changes as driven by the arrival of even newer groups. In the end, Petrie's engagement with eugenics, discussed masterfully by Chalice, still drove him to divide humanity into high and low races, including making tropical Africans in the low category. So But ultimately, what Petrie shares in common with Chariots of the Gods is a pessimism about human creativity. People cannot innovate. Instead, change is brought by new peoples in a kind of package. Chariots of the Gods takes it even farther by invoking ancient astronauts, but the subtext is the same. All non-white, non-Western accomplishments should be attributed to outside forces, with the notable exception of monuments like Stonehenge, ironically given Petrie's early involvement in documenting that. Vera and Gordon place Stargate within a larger genre of Hollywood films that glorify a white savior, a redeemer of the weak who saves a non-white, primitive, and superstitious other from oppression and triumphs in spite of impossible odds and powerful villains. Often an outsider and overwhelmingly male, the white savior frequently himself is recognized as a god or a divine represented by natives, as in Stargate and Rudyard Kipling's story of the British Raj, the man who would be king. Indiana Jones served a similar role in Temple of Doom, and we can see this repeated over and over again. In Stargate, Jackson is a mythic hero, facing and overcoming a series of obstacles transformed by the process, akin to Moses, so back to Stranger in a Strange Land, and science fiction protagonists like Paul Atreides in Dune or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. They go on to argue that Stargate was a thinly disguised imperial metaphor and justification for the first Gulf War, which had happened a couple of years before the film started shooting, with Ray standing in for Saddam Hussein. But here I can say they missed the mark. The Gulf War never came up in my many conversations with Devlin and Emmerich or anyone else involved with the production. If anything, there was a strong anti-military and even anti-colonial undercurrent in the dialogue, with Jackson constantly calling out O'Neill's bellicose attitude. Additionally, wresting Kuwait from Saddam Hussein does not provide a particularly good parallel. The defeat of Iraqi forces was accomplished through a broad international coalition and the exercise of massive and overwhelming military power, not a ragtag group of rebels led by foreigners. Far from aiding insurgents in Iraq, the coalition abandoned them once the goal of liberating Kuwait was met. Unlike Ray, Saddam Hussein lived to fight and oppress another day. One must look farther back in history and film to find the inspiration for Stargate, and that is, of course, Lawrence of Arabia. Indeed, Devlin is on record as seeing Stargate as Lawrence of Arabia on another planet. Here we have a white savior that matches the hero's journey of Daniel Jackson, as well as a cinematographic spectacle set in the East with dramatic desert landscapes, exotic backgrounds, and a cast of thousands, all things that Emmerich and Devlin were trying to replicate and kind of revive in film. The parallels don't end there, though. Like Jackson, T.E. Lawrence was a scholar, an accomplished archaeologist, and a bit of an outsider to the military elite, who would doubtless have characterized him as a dweeb, as Jackson is labeled in the film. He had a deep knowledge of the region's history, as well as contacts and the linguistic ability to engage with local leaders and ultimately persuade them to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the ultimate Oriental despots during the First World War. Unlike the Gulf War with its massive coalition, Lawrence, like Jackson, operated more or less on his own, forging an alliance with various local leaders and groups who bore the main brunt of the rebellion. Both Devlin and Emmerich mentioned their goal of replicating the look and feel of films like Lawrence to me throughout the production. In a very deliberate way, Stargate is an amalgam of the Ten Commandments with its Egyptian setting and Lawrence of Arabia, a desert rebellion against despotic forces, both involving mythic heroes who are strangers in strange lands. Stargate's white savior narrative is more complicated in other ways. One important subtext of the film's plot is a critique of colonial domination and a condemnation of the misuse of religion and technological power to dominate through fear, a kind of Marxian analysis about false consciousness, in this case practiced by alien overlords on humans who have been absorbed into an interstellar extractive empire. In fact, it's not a bad critique of displays of power by ancient Egyptian kings who used spectacle, theology, and the threat of violence to support their rule. And we touched upon this briefly in an earlier session as well, this kind of glorification of pharaonic power, when in fact, yeah, if you weren't the pharaoh, maybe it wasn't so great. Of course, in Stargate, the humans dominated our dark-skinned natives, which you might think would align with the dark continent theme found in the writing of 19th and 20th century colonial literary figures like Haggard and Conrad. However, as a person of color of Filipino descent, Dean Devlin deliberately pushed for dark-skinned actors to play the descendants of Egyptian, resulting in the casting of people of color, people of African ancestry like Jay Davidson and Jaimin Hansu, Hispanic ancestry like Alexis Cruz, or South Asian ancestry like Eric Avari. He deliberately chose to make both the good and evil Egyptians dark, like North Africans, in part because of the whitewashing of ancient Egypt. And he actually mentioned this to me, but also the lack of decent roles for people of color like him. He had become frustrated with the kind of casting that existed in Hollywood at that time, and of course it still bleeds into today. Of course, the film's white savior plot, with its mostly white military team and American protagonists, creates a kind of cognitive dissonance, and that to some extent undermines this idea of empowerment. But at the same time, the choices in casting subvert the racist message inherent in the casting of other popular films, like Gods of Egypt, which has already been mentioned. I mean, seriously, these two guys do not look like ancient or modern or any North African Egyptian. Or even worse, Ridley Scott's horribly cast and racist film, Exodus, Gods, and Kings. And even in older films like the Cecil B. DeMille 1950s Exodus film, of course, all of the Egyptians are played by white Northern European actors. And I can say from personal experience that this skin color is not well adapted to the North African environment. Ancient Egypt has long been the subject also of a sexualized and eroticized gaze in Western historical accounts, paintings, novels, popular media, and films like Stargate. And we heard a bit about this just a little while ago. Egyptian bodies, including mummies, have also been sexualized, but in addition queered, in Halperin's sense of reordering or disordering of sexuality and gender, and a restructuring of the relations of power and desire through the creation of ambiguity. Along these lines, Montserrat observed that mummies were, and I quote, an entity whose sexuality is ambiguous and equivocal, inextricably linked with the somatic status of the mummy itself. As Metzko points out, the Egyptian body was associated in the Western imagination with death, immortality, sexuality, and revivification. Stargate science fiction villain Ray embodies all of these principles, an immortal constantly rejuvenated through alien technology who devised normative sexual and gendered categorizations, much like the original Egyptian sun god, who embodied both male and female principles, and in myths like those surrounding the Eye of Re could shift genders and sexualities, a topic I'll mention later. However, Stargate started originally as a kind of mummy movie, with an aged Ra akin to Boris Karloff's mummy, kept alive through technology. Jasmine Day's excellent summary of the mummy genre, and in particular the plot progression, fits Stargate's story arc really well. The discovery of the Stargate reflects mysterious beginnings, including a kind of curse to be deciphered and transgressed. Initial excitement in exploring the forbidden, leading to disaster and awakening an evil ancient Egyptian force that had slumbered for millennia. In earlier versions, Day's pre-classic, the protagonist succumbed to the mummy's curse, as in the end of Bram Stoker's Jewel of the Seven Stars, when the attempt to revive Queen Tara, who also has strong queer aspects, resulted in disaster. Stargate's ending is happier, like Day's characterization of the later classic curse, where the evil force is ultimately neutralized and the carnage is more limited. Stargate was transformed and queered through the casting of Jay Davidson, which happened late in pre-production, in part because of Jay's notoriety in securing an Oscar nomination for his gender and sexually ambiguous role in The Crying Game. This shift was improvised. Even when I joined the pre-production, the crew, there was still talk of a withered body transforming into a youthful one, or perhaps just sort of continuing on in the withered state. But in the end, Emmerich and Devlin decided to deliberately queer the production via Jay's androgyny and sexual fluidity. As Metzko points out, creating an undercurrent of homoerotic tension between Ray and Jackson, along with the discomfort created by Ray's scantily clad harem of youths that makes the overt heterosexual storyline pale by comparison. Metzko sees this as the policing of heterosexual boundaries against an invasion of queerness, although she acknowledges that more positive interpretations are possible. Based on my experience working on the film and taking into consideration that Emmerich is openly gay, I would be inclined to argue for Metzko's alternative explanation that, and I quote, the profile and visibility of the queer body is a positive iconic image representing an acknowledgement of difference. If one were to follow Halperin's definition of queerness, the reordering of sexual behaviors, constructions of gender, and logics of representation presented in Stargate may be construed to be an important step forward for some viewers. Whatever its final reception, in the end, it is the tension between Ray and Jackson that drives the film, centering its queerness. As Hathel Thomas discusses, Hagar's anti-hero Aisha in the novel She reflects a similar queer otherness rooted in the late 19th century fears of the monstrous things that lurked at the edges of empire. What many scholars have characterized as the Imperial Gothic. At once white and the other, Aisha is an amalgam of the late Victorian racial and sexual anxiety that refuses easy containment. Like Ray, she crosses the boundaries between life and death, in her case, disordering gendered stereotypes through her superior intellectual and physical strength and ruthless domination of the local society through fear and mystical power. Hagar's use of the uncanny in She destabilizes categories of race, gender, and sexuality through an ultimately anti-imperial and queer subtext, which suggests other ways of doing and being. And of all of his novels, this was probably the one that was most criticized by his contemporaries. Hagar's vision also reflects a late Victorian atavistic anxiety of an imperial periphery rebounding upon the core, contributing to its degeneration. There's also an element of guilt that reflects the Imperial Gothic's uneasiness with the inevitable transgressions of empire and threats to the core that arise through encounters with otherness. Describing Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Judith Wilt says, and I quote, "There at the bottommost, inmost station of the advancing Western Empire, the imperialist meets a force long ignored that rashly penetrated with its counterattack, utterly defeats the West. Then rashly penetrated, in its counterattack, utterly defeats the West." So note the sexual imagery here as well. Mehmet Bey in Hammer's 1959 Mummy plays upon these imperial anxieties, remarkably explicitly calling out the British archaeologist, and I quote, "You're an intruder, you force your way in. Does this not trouble you at times, your conscience perhaps?" Later on he warns, "Profanity, blasphemy, religious desecration, all these you are guilty of, but the powers with which you have meddled do not rest easy. I think you shall not go unpunished." In many ways, Ray is reminiscent of Hagar's anti-hero. The Eternal Queen is liminal in a classic Orientalist fashion. She is at once sensual, described as reptilian in her movements, sexually attractive, violent, and ruthless. Hagar's portrayal surely draws upon Roman accounts of Cleopatra, which played an important role as a central theme in Victorian Orientalism. This trope is embodied by the famous 1887 painting by Cabanel of Cleopatra testing poisons. On the one hand, the queen is sensual, languid, sumptuously dressed and surrounded by luxury, reclining on her divan. Ruthless, she watches dispassionately as the prisoners die, her latent power is signaled by the lion and tiger skins that she lies upon and the live panther that sits next to her. Like Aisha and Cleopatra, Ray defies gendered and sexual stereotypes, adopting a similar languid and sensual guise with violence implied by his muscular enforcers, as you see here, that always stand in the background. Challenged in many ways as an actor, I think I have to say that Davidson did a superb job in conveying this uncanny sensuality and ambivalence, perhaps leveraging his experience as a model. On set, I would look over and be struck by just how well he embodied this trope through movement and pose. Mescal sees these features as a feminization of Ray. Now there's she again. There we go. In a similar way, one could argue that Aisha was masculinized, creating a kind of feminist subtext in She. However, Ray's court costume is really an elaborate and colorful high-tech version of an Egyptian king, specifically Akhenaten, as you saw in the last slide, who himself embodies a degree of sexual and gendered ambiguity, perhaps already in antiquity, but definitely shifting through various interpretations in modern times, as discussed excellently by the late Dominic Montserrat. I would argue that the costume with its horned sun disk evoking the goddess Hathor, along with his Victorian bustier-like costume, were part of a deliberate creation of gender and sexual fluidity and ambiguity. While the costume designer was doubtless intentionally invoking the Victorian bustier for the modern audience, the costume itself also resonates with corselets shown in militarized representations of kings and deities, adapted here by Kushites for their lion god Epetimak, further undermining gendered binaries. In a similar way, the Hathoric crown in turn resonates with the myth of the Eye of Re, who you see directly juxtaposed. And so it's quite apropos and consistent with Re's own ambiguous nature. Although one often thinks of the goddess Sekhmet, Hathor is the deity most strongly associated as the Eye of Re, and it is this goddess who must be convinced to abandon the destruction of humanity and later return to Egypt and make Ray whole after wandering into Nubia. Of course, the Ayah's also Ray's enforcer and leonine aspect manifest as Hathor, Sachmet, Mut, and so on, apropos to the plot, and again complicating notions of fixed gendered roles, which of course even in ancient Egypt, gender could be quite fluid. Ray's final querying is in the alien who literally inhabits his body, creating what Mescal terms a kind of cyborg. This plot device was also an afterthought, added in post-production based on audience reactions to test screenings, surprisingly given how central it was to, eventually to the various TV series and spin-offs of the film, including Stargate Catherine, the one I more recently participated in. In order to make Ray more menacing, Emmerich and Devlin decided to add the whole alien subplot, why his subtitles often don't match the actual Egyptian. Before, he was just the willing and co-opted tool of the aliens, oppressing his own people with an alien ideology, iconography, and technology in exchange for the luxuries and immortality the aliens could give him. An interesting subtext that remains to some extent, but would have been stronger had Jay been able to pull off the performance. Adding to the subplot of alien possession, glowing eyes, and a distorted and overlaid voice, a voice actor who I worked with, actually repeated the lines and then they blended them together. That was the only way that Jay as Ray could appear sufficiently credible as a powerful threat, which says something about gendered and sexual stereotypes within American and Western society. In any case, adding the alien possession makes Ray even more strongly the other, but also a kind of hybrid, occupying a Baba-esque in-between space that disrupts classifications and thus enhances his queerness. But the real Egyptologist, me, and the fictional one, Daniel Jackson, were strangers in strange, both the real Egyptologist, me, and fictional one, Daniel Jackson, were strangers in strange lands. Moses' characterization of himself, and you see a nice quote from Madeleine L'Engle, one of my favorite science fiction authors. Moses' characterization of himself resonates with the film's protagonist and his journey through the Stargate. In this respect and others, he is far removed from the classical archaeological movie stereotype Indiana Jones, who was more a man of action than academic and returns triumphantly to America after his adventures. Daniel Jackson also has a greater sense of ethics compared to the kind of shady dealings that, let's face it, Indiana Jones was involved with. Vera and Gordon soften their critique by noting that in contrast to the usual trope, Stargate's narrative is not simply a matter of the protagonist's whiteness triumphing and saving his darker allies. In contrast to the typical white outsider who swoops in and returns home, Jackson is himself transformed by the experience and finds a new home and family with his friends and allies, where he is finally no longer a stranger. Even O'Neill banishes his demons and becomes a more humane person. James Spader, the indie actor who James Spader, an indie actor used to playing quirky characters that can also be seen as a stranger in a strange land, and here you see us together on the set of Stargate. He was a really fun guy to work with. No stranger to a film set, he was nonetheless thrust onto the set of a big budget action adventure science fiction epic. And he kept pointing out how weird this was and kept saying he would never work in Hollywood again and was only doing it to cover the cost of his handcrafted yacht. And here you see her here, the Flying Dream, a beautiful, beautiful boat. He showed me the half hull as it was still under construction. He showed me the half hull, which was in his trailer, just gorgeous. It's a revival of the 1914 America's Cup winning design, and pretty much single-handedly he revived the artisanal boat crafting industry in New England. Fortunately, his prediction turned out to be quite the opposite. He's had a great career in Hollywood. But he brought a certain quirkiness to his portrayal of an academic that I think made it one of the more convincing in film. I worked with him intensively on both language and his character. We made his own, being fully engaged in his craft, adjusting his dialogue and so on, discussing it with Dean and Roland. I was really very impressed with the seriousness he took on with the role. I also managed to get a few Easter eggs into the film. One of these you may have noticed is in one of the early scenes, Daniel Jackson says, as he's sort of critiquing the translation, he says, "Oh, they must have used Budge. I don't know why they keep reprinting his books." And as most of you know, Budge, this is a reference to the fact that Budge, writing over 100 years ago now, is off copyright, and therefore his books are continuously reprinted in spite of the fact that they're way out of date. And I've actually had people comment to me, "Oh, I shouldn't be using those for translations." And no, 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 you should not. So at least that's something. And then, but perhaps my favorite thing was the writing the scene where Shady, the heroine, teaches James Spader, the Daniel Jackson character, to speak or how to pronounce ancient Egyptian. And again, I will apologize in advance. I couldn't tell if my sound came through or not, but I will play this in the hopes that it did. So just in case you couldn't hear that, when he points to a single figure of a god, he says Necher, and she says Nate. And then he points to a group of gods, he says Naturu. And the R drops away, but is preserved in the plural, which is a central sort of feature of vocalizing ancient Egyptian. So when Antonio Loprieno, who I worked with as a graduate student at UCLA, saw the film, he said, Nate, Naturu. Oh, Stuart, beautiful. So that was a nice nod, and it does teach you at least a little bit about how to pronounce ancient Egyptian. I'm also in the film, in the lecture scene at the beginning. You can see me sort of in the, if you have the letterbox version looking out into the audience, I'm in the left-hand side wearing this very sort of early 90s sweater, laughing at James Spader and his dialogue. And just as an aside, this places me only 3 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon. You can see the connections there. But really, Stargate is an exercise in hyperreality, translating ancient Egypt directly into the realm of science fiction. In this sense, the film operates like the Victorian focus on rich visual reconstructions, like the work of Al-Muqaddimah, that as Mosher has observed, is transported the viewer to antiquity, seductively using archaeological details to convince audiences that his visions could have been real. Stargate created a similar sense of immersion, translating ancient Egypt into the realm of science fiction through the rich visual complexity and Egyptological detail produced by a combination of Emmerich and Devlin's good instincts and dedication to the suspension of disbelief, other key members of the crew from the art, costumes, and props department, of course, the actors, who are just brilliant, and I really have to give kudos, and my own work on the film, especially in recreating vocalized Egyptian. As far as I know, the only time vocalized Egyptian has appeared on the silver screen. If nothing else, the language enhances the feeling of an alternate reality and contributes something novel, but in a very real way, language and scholarship plays a central role in the film's plot. Kurt Russell came up to me on a particularly hot day in the desert and complained that what I was doing didn't matter, and they would screw up the language in the end anyway. But in the end, he was wrong. Thanks to the support of Emmerich and Devlin, who were all in and brought me in at every stage of production, the language turned out just beautifully. Lynn Mesko commented that Egyptologists were horrified by the film, but my experience has been the opposite. It's become a kind of Egyptological cult classic with a fun, if wildly inaccurate and in need of correction, science fiction premise, and an opportunity to hear actors speaking a real approximation of ancient Egyptian. And many of the features, like the Eye of Re, resonate with Egyptian mythology, and we've seen this with other examples as well. This does, however, raise a more serious question, which has come up. Have I contributed to misconceptions about ancient Egypt, like the chariots of the gods inspired premise that the ancient astronauts were responsible for the pyramids? Although I seriously doubt anyone thinks seriously that they were landing pads for alien spacecraft. Mosher points out that the ways in which the representations of ancient Egypt are incorporated into popular culture shape understandings of ancient worlds like Egypt and are placed in dialogue with more academic treatments and previous traditions of reception. Films like Stargate reflect the deeply and longly held notions about the nature of Egyptian civilization. As is the case for science fiction in general and film and other media discussed at this conference, futuristic ideas adapt historical context and imagery to suit contemporary beliefs and concerns, some of which have a long history. We should not expect them to adhere to an academic standard, whether in Sun Ra's Egypto-futuristic music or in Stargate. For me, we should place these ancient Egyptian-themed science fiction creations in their cultural and historical context. In the end, they tell us more about the individuals and societies that created them, rather than the civilization that inspired them. I'd just like to call out, in particular, dedicate this talk to the late John Callender, who I sadly just overlapped briefly with at UCLA before his untimely death. And special thanks to Antonio Loprieno, Gordon Smith, and the various actors who did such a wonderful job on the film, Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, and a special call out to Eric Avari, the guy who played Kasuf, who also gave me a recommendation for the mummy gigs. So thank you very much. I apologize for going a bit long, but hope you've enjoyed my talk.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was absolutely incredible. And I know from talking to people at this conference, so many people have something they watched, a film, a TV show, a book they read as a kid that inspires them to get into this. And I'm sure there are many of our participants who are in that position. To hear about it is amazing. And such amazing stories from the set as well, which I think underlines the value of science fiction in learning about the ancient Near East, ancient Africa. We've actually just got a comment from Frederick saying, Naffy Way, he starts, Stargate got me into Egyptology. So I want to thank you, Professor Smith, for bringing that powerful vision of Egypt to life. And here's a question. Assuming you're ready, Stuart, for some questions.
Yeah, actually, just one quick comment on this exact topic. And that's, I remember a few years later, I can't remember exactly what year it was, at an RC conference, I was in the book room and overheard two young graduate students saying how Stargate got them into Egyptology. So, so that was a pretty cool and validating.
That's amazing. These things are so powerful. And definitely Frederick is of that opinion. And he says that he always thought that the reconstructed Egyptian language of Stargate and the Mummy really set those movies apart because it makes the ancient culture feel so lifelike. He also says he found it odd that after this golden era of vocalized Hollywood Egyptian in the early 90s or early 2000s, that this didn't catch on. And now movies like the Tom Cruise Mummy or X-Men Apocalypse, or even official appearances of the actual pharaohs in the Golden Parade in Cairo recently, with its celebrated real Egyptian song, invariably resorts to the inconvenient Sejem F. I'm not an Egyptologist, so I'm doing my best pseudo pronunciation that we know doesn't really represent the spoken language at all. Frederick would love to hear your take on why you think that is. Is Hollywood no longer interested in this kind of realism in the language department?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it does also strike me as a bit odd that no one has taken this up, especially you know, in Hollywood. Okay, you can see it; it's expedient, partly expediency. With the Mummy films, it was Eric Avari who saw in the script all this Egyptian dialogue, and he said, "Oh, this guy Stuart Smith, he's great because he'll, you know, he's flexible, he's not all fussy or anything like that, and he can do a great job translating this stuff." And I think, but clearly Stephen Summers, the director there, as opposed to Emmerich and Devlin, were really into it. He just thought it was kind of a fun add-on and didn't treat it very seriously. Most of the dialogue, though, turned out pretty well, but I wasn't on set. I didn't really coach the actors. I gave them little Berlitz-style language tapes. So even with the Mummy movies, they weren't all that serious. With Stargate Catherine, interestingly enough, they wanted to replicate the original film. So I was on the set of that film for quite a lot. And you know, it's a low-budget production, so it suffers a little bit from that. But the language turned out beautifully again. Thanks again to the actors doing a bang-up job, working really hard on it, and the producer Matt Miller and director Bryce. I forget her last name. She's actually the daughter of. Now I can't remember. I'm blanking on names, which I sometimes do. But daughter of a famous director. I can't think of his name now. But anyway.
No comment.
But anyway, she was great too. So they were very supportive there. But yeah, I was disappointed with the Mummy because they did actually have an Egyptologist translate the lines, but apparently they didn't make any attempt at vocalization. And I think part of the reason maybe is that Egyptologists don't take vocalization seriously. I've had comments like this over time, and there are a core group of them. Mainly my sense is German, or kind of coming from a German school. Antonio, for example, is Italian, but he studied at Göttingen, so has that German background with Jung and people like this who are really interested in pronunciation, which, as I mentioned, is you don't need it to translate, but it's important if you want to understand the structure of the language and compare it to other languages. And for me, it just makes it, you know, more living, and I don't understand why people don't do it. It's not that hard. It takes a little bit of work, but even if you just, you know, like sometimes on set, you know, when I get the call and I have 5 minutes to translate and vocalize something, I'd take what I knew and then I'd wing it. but it still makes, I knew the structure of it, so you can make it sound like localized Egyptian, even though you might get the wrong vowel or something like that. But it just changes the language so much. It's like Ramses is Ria Masesu. I mean, that's totally different. Or even the main conceit of the film, Ra. So when Daniel Jackson points up to the symbol of the Eye of Ra and says Ra to Hatsu, Hatsu goes, because to him it's Ryu. And this tendency of Egyptologists to do these easy transcriptions. Yes, it's easy is part of the reason. But then I also had Egyptologists tell me, oh, we don't really know, do we? And but I have to tell them, yes, we do kind of know. It is a reconstruction because we only have that limited number of words from the cuneiform text. But we have the entire Coptic lexicon. So we know how it was pronounced in 200 CE. And so then you can create a pretty plausible reconstruction going back to whatever time period, particularly that period of around 1200 to 1450 BCE, where you have all this evidence.
Absolutely.
It makes me sad. I think, especially like a song, it would make it so much better if you did the vocalization. But I would say to ask me, I would have done it for them for free.
Well, that's one of the things I thought was amazing that you pointed out about your experience is you would give them how to pronounce it, and then when they acted it, it brought it alive in a whole new level. And it suggested something about the symbiotic relationship between creative arts and scholarly Egyptology, where one can really enhance the other in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
But I totally get your point about how different it sounds to us when it's pronounced properly. I'm external to Egyptology, but from what I can tell, there's a very kind of westernized, almost kind of Greek version of the names of things that people use, Cheops rather than Khufu, that westernizes the sound just to our own ears.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of ultimate extension of that is the use of the Greek isations, if you will, of different names. And I thought about this a lot. I always, in using royal names, I always use at least the traditional Egyptological transcription of the name. But in deities' names, it's hard. So, like, how do you not use Isis? I mean, for Stargate Origins, Auset was Isis. Was the alien, and there, of course, I used Auset. But in professional publications or in lectures and whatnot, you use something like Auset or Yanpu for Anubis, and people won't. It's not legible to the broader public. So it's an issue, but that's partly, it's not just that the broader public isn't familiar, but it's that Egyptology in its origins pulled from those Greek sources, especially in the absence of an understanding of hieroglyphs. And there's so much in these films as well and in popular culture that goes back to pre-decipherment ideas about ancient Egypt reflected in classical texts and so on.
Absolutely. Daniel Solomon has just posted in the chat that the critiques of the Egyptological attitudes towards these or the Egyptian language is really valid, especially when we begin to claim that at least we are making their names live today, which I've seen often used as a justification for human remains in museums, etc., etc. But yeah, what names are we pronouncing? Is it the names they would have pronounced? And in many cases, it seems no. But it's great to know that people can pronounce them. So is it a matter of changing the discipline before we change popular culture, do you think? Yeah,
ultimately, yes. I think I mentioned it just a minute ago, but I'll just reinforce it. Egyptologists are reluctant to even accept the vocalization is real, and certainly that vocalization is worthwhile. And I mean, partly it's my sort of, I'm a sort of hybrid myself. I've used sort of anthropology, anthropological archaeology, Egyptology, kind of all bundled together. But that anthropological background, I really appreciated, John Calendar's approach and then Antonio's approach. And I sadly never studied with John Calendar. He was an early casualty to the AIDS epidemic. Very, very sad because he was a brilliant scholar and a really humane and nice man. And then Antonio, both of them were very, vocalization was central to their research. And so in class, I would either be with students of John who were vocalizing all the time, or with Antonio, who was also doing these vocalizations and etymologies and going back and tracing pronunciation, which is fascinating. I think it's very cool. And then, as you say, I think like in a museum exhibit, why not vocalize the names? And names are one of the things that we know a lot about, because those are the things that appear in those early cuneiform texts. And some names of deities and things like that. I mean, you could transcribe, you could still include the old one, but maybe include the new one there. But Egyptology has been reluctant to do that. And even in something like, again, that big spectacle of the moving the pharaohs, when they had all that beautiful music and everything else, why not just do the vocalizations? But yeah, no one's that interested. It's a shame. And I think you really miss something. It's like I said, it gave me a real appreciation of the music of the language, which you don't get. And then especially in the context of a performance, as opposed to even in class, it really did enhance it and move it into that realm of hyperreality, where it became something real, even though it's a kind of simulation. But it really transformed my appreciation for the language. I can never see Egyptian as this sort of dead thing anymore. To me, it's alive. And hopefully at least people seeing the films that I've done will get that out of it, if nothing else. That, and you shouldn't use Butch.
100%. Mark Walker has actually commented, which I hope is a nice pat on the back. At the time of Stargate, he went behind the scenes at the British Museum, and there was a Stargate action figure on one of the curator's desks. So absolutely nice. Enjoyed by scholars and professionals.
Yeah, I never had anybody say, "Oh, that was a horrible film that that you shouldn't have done." I did have one Egyptologist say that it was too easy to understand the ancient Egyptian, which it's like, what did you want me to do? I mean, I want people to understand it, so I didn't make it too weird. So that, but that also told me that Egyptologists could indeed follow it, which of course one can if you know something about Egyptian and so I think it's become this kind of cult classic amongst Egyptologists.
Yeah, I definitely get a sense that there is an assumption that all Egyptologists have watched Stargate and will have an opinion about it. Let's make sure I get through everyone's questions. Sean asks, can you think of any other projects today which are bridging pop culture and the Egypt of Egyptology? It's something that people have mentioned in earlier talks, but are there any that stick out to you?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not very good, like the most recent Mummy film, which theoretically had an Egyptological character, but it became a kind of vehicle for Tom Cruise. Also a lost opportunity, because that film was based on Bram Stoker's Jewel of the Seven Stars, and it could have been a kind of, again, in a way that Stargate, even though it plays on these tropes, it somehow subverts them. The same with H. Rider Haggard's She, which can be read as a kind of critique. They could have done the same thing. They could have created a sort of feminist version. Sure, make her a kind of anti-hero, but she's potentially, like the Mummy, a sympathetic character, and it could have been a sort of feminist, version of that. And so many lost opportunities. I don't see anything in particular coming out down the pipeline. Yeah, a lot of them, like Gods of Egypt, I didn't actually watch the film, I have to admit, because it looked just so horrible, and I don't think I could have gotten past the casting. I gather there was some Egyptological content in there, but the casting is so horrible, and the same thing with Exodus Gods and Men. Hollywood is still sort of stuck in that same place, and Egyptology is not too far ahead of Hollywood in the way it thinks about ancient Egypt.
That's so true. I do remember there being some good critiques of those things, though, that suggest that people are cottoning on to the fact that representation matters, and that whoever's casting could do a better job.
Yes, yeah. Ridley Scott got severely criticized, and rightly so, for that casting in Exodus, Gods and Men. I think also we're at an inflection point in Egyptology that matches the inflection point in broader society, about the Africanity of ancient Egypt. And I've been talking about this both, sort of a little bit in publication and a lot to colleagues for a couple of decades now. 20 years ago, I got no traction. I would say, Egypt is really African, and the Egyptians, you stick them on a bus in the American South, Montgomery, Alabama, in 1951. They're not sitting in the front seat, okay? Modern Egyptians or ancient Egyptians, for that matter. But people didn't get it, why it's important to acknowledge Egypt as an African civilization and the ancient Egyptians as dark-skinned Africans. But I think that's changing. The idea of Egypt as an African civilization is now becoming better, and hopefully Hollywood's representation of Egyptians will improve as well. As I say, it really was. I talked about this a lot with Dean Devlin, and he really was keen to make the casting of Stargate diverse, which he didn't have to do. I mean, they could have made it these white people who have been taken from Egypt and transferred to this other planet. But he was aware of that critique and the fact that ancient Egyptians were always depicted as white. So of course, the Afrocentric movement was pretty hot at that particular moment with Bernal's Black Athena coming out and so on. So he's responding to that, but also as a person of color himself. He was using that as a kind of critique of Hollywood casting. Couldn't do much about the main roles because that's driven by money, basically. But he did everything he could to give opportunities to people. And if you're the actors, all the actors have had reasonably good careers, and Djimon Hounsou, of course, has had probably the most dramatically good career. Jay Davidson just hated acting, so he got out of the business immediely after. But he got a nice injection of cash for the film. So.
All worth it then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, one of the your joke about Budge, which I thought was particularly great as somebody who works on 19th century Egyptology rather than like modern legit Egyptology, is that Budge was one of these people claiming that the ancient Egyptians were not only white but all Aryan, blonde, and you look at it now and you think, really? But yeah. Apparently, 100 years or so ago, very, very commonly believed. Which I think leads on to James's question nicely, and then I'm going to ask you Julia's question, both about your personal experiences, really, and advice in one case. So James's question, he says it's a very broad meta question, and that you mentioned that criticism of Stargate and the differing views on whether it succeeds in undercutting some of the Orientalism or issues with the Däniken style premise. How do you deal with those criticisms, personally speaking? Do you have any thoughts on how we have those discussions about creatively presenting the past in ways that make enough space for critique, improvement, and creativity without the discussion becoming toxic or risking missing important critical perspectives?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the key is contextualizing. I mean, as an archaeologist, if I had to define archaeology with one word, it would be context, and so I bring that to everything. So I think in looking at past views of scholars like Budge and especially Petrie, you have to contextualize, and that doesn't mean saying that just accepting that they're just a product of their time. Because most of these people, when they came out with these ideas, somebody pushed back against them. So going all the way back to Types of Mankind, no less a figure than Frederick Douglass explicitly critiqued the book and said, these guys are full of it. Humanity is humanity. You don't have this classification of races. And it's similar even with figures like Petrie, with Reisner, who came up with horribly racist ideas. But at the same time, we can, I think, acknowledge the good things that they did too. In the case of Petrie, one of the most impressive things that Petrie did, and this is something that's gotten lost, I think, a bit in the critique, which is, of course, completely valid, his support of eugenics and this idea of high and low races that would influence immigration into England, for example, and a bit his view. Again, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of his view of the dynastic race. It's actually a lot more complicated. It's later figures like Emery and Derry who create this master race. Petrie just sees these kind of racial admixtures, but he does rank people, and people who are darker are inferior. But the big thing that he really contributed was a shift away from big monuments, pharaohs, and inscriptions to the everyday. And there's some wonderful quotes in his little book on method and aims in archaeology, where he talks about the aim of the archaeologist is to save lives, to bring people who've forgotten to humanity back into the human consciousness. And that kind of thing, I mean, it still gives me chills just thinking about it. I mean, that's why I do archaeology. I don't care that much about kings, and although it's, you know, kind of interesting and fun to explore, what I want to find out in the case of Tombos in Sudan is, you know, who are these colonists? How did they interact with the local people? Who are the local people? How did that interaction transform their society? All these are questions that you do not see in the historical record. You can use the historical record, combine it with archaeology, and come up with something better. And Petrie saw this and the importance of material culture and the small things that in the 1880s people were throwing away because you couldn't get money for them. And another wonderful quote from that book is that every artifact is a portion of life solidified. So you can see the work of the craftsman, you know, the life of the person in the artifact. And so in that respect, and it's easy to forget that, he also came up with the entire methodology of seriation, which is we'd still use today. So from that perspective, I think he was extremely innovative and a positive force. But of course, you have to balance that against the negative side of things. Similar with Reisner, he was one of the leading proponents, early proponents of systematic archaeology. He actually quantified things, which like nobody was doing. Even Petrie, you know, wasn't counting and doing statistics, but Reisner was. So he was way ahead of his time in that respect. But the stuff is horribly racist. And again, it's not like there weren't voices critiquing those things, even Reisner specifically, but also figures like, you know, W.B. Du Bois, you know, talking about ancient Egypt and this kind of thing. So there were, you know, you have to realize that these people were making deliberate choices, and we have to acknowledge that. I think in understanding that critique, we can understand the sort of trajectory and history of the discipline, and then we can also be self-critical. Where do we get some of these ideas? Are they coming from this racist place in the past? And should we be, you know, self-correcting? And that's an important discussion that I think, you know, there was a bit of that around Black Athena, but it kind of fell apart in a sort of overwhelming and to some extent fair, but to in many ways unfair critique of Afrocentrism and Bernal. But I think we're having a more honest discussion now.
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck that you mentioned H. Rider Haggard, and I was reminded of, I mean, I think nowadays we see, it's very easy to see figures like Haggard and say, well, they were into the colonialism and they're bad. But you read some of what Haggard says about mummies, and he said, well, leave them in their tombs, don't put them in museums. And you think, actually, some of these views are still kind of relevant and also feel very modern to us. So I think, yeah, I mean, everyone's that I come across, and it seems like you come across as well, especially in the 19th century, they have some opinions that we now find abhorrent. Other people don't, and push back against that. And I think the history of the discipline is as interesting as some of the most cutting edge debates, actually. So I think a lot of Egyptologists think the history of the discipline should be taught now, which I would agree with.
Yeah, I would agree too.
Yeah.
It's interesting and telling that I've been checking biographies of George Glidden, who wrote Types of Mankind and supplied the Egyptian skulls to Morton, who was the anatomist that came up with this racial classification. And nobody mentions Types of Mankind. Like you look in the who was who in Egyptology, not a mention at all about the fact that it wasn't just Types of Mankind. He published a lot on this topic, and it really is the foundation of American scientific racism. And an underpinning for slavery, and then later on Jim Crow, and it bleeds even into attitudes today. And that whole classification of, you know, Caucasoid, you know, Negroid, Mongoloid, and so on, and the ranking of it, that it's still used in physical or biological anthropology today. I think it should be abandoned. It's racist undertones. I don't think you can get away from it. But you can see the legacy of that. And that is entangled with the beginnings of American Egyptology. But nobody talks about that, or rarely do they.
No, that's such a good point. I know people have been talking a little bit at the conference about money and how money funds a particular image of Egyptology. I've spoken to Egyptologists who, you know, they go out into the desert and they're told to wear khaki because that's what people want. But equally, it continues this image, which is hopefully most people would agree is quite outdated and continues something that looks colonial or imperialist. I've said I'm going to ask Julia's question. I feel like I've rambled and detracted from it. But Julia says, thank you so much, Stuart. Always so good to hear your lectures. There seems to be such a tension within the academy, at least among some groups, between serious work and popular work. I think that the job market, with the job market so tough these days, this is especially tricky for young scholars, female scholars, and or scholars of color whose popular engagement might minimize or distract from their scholarly contributions. Do you have any advice based on your experiences for early career scholars who want to navigate this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, there was a moment with Stargate where I thought, well, should my name in the credits be a pseudonym? Do I really want to own up to this? Because I could be punished. In the end, I decided that, well, if people were bothered by it, I didn't really want to go there and hang out with them anyway. But also that it would the little extra notoriety would actually probably be more beneficial than it was harmful. In that if there were two equal candidates and they said, oh yeah, the guy who did Stargate, let's bring him in for an interview. I'm going to hear some stories about the film. Of course, that's a special case. So the other question, I mean, there is an enduring thing. It's not just in Egyptology; it's in the academy in general over popular versus trade books, for example, versus sort of more serious academic works. And I've even encountered this as a past chair of the Department of Anthropology. I had to deal with promotions and tenure and that kind of thing, and it definitely even comes up today. And in fact, I recently wrote a promotion letter for someone who produced a couple of books, but both from popular venues, so they didn't really want to consider them seriously. And I told them, this person, you should be in the UC system, you can actually get promoted ahead if you're very productive. And I said, this person should be, skip ahead because this is an impressive record and it's critically important. So it is tricky though. So I don't know in terms of the job market. I think there's more interest now in public engagement, and so but you still, I don't think you can, unless you get lucky and there's this particular position that emphasizes that. I think you still have to provide a balance. So you need the serious academic output, but I think the public engagement, if it's sort of robust and you frame it well, I think could be an advantage. But again, the curve is still kind of bending on that. So, but I think it is bending. But nevertheless, the academy tends to be a bit conservative, in part because I guess of old people like me. But I'm more progressive, so I'm a cool old person, I guess. But older faculty are often sort of stuck in the past and past ways of doing, and because of the nature of the trajectory of an academic career, that can cause it to lag behind a bit, which again I've seen. And even younger people can take up that, and then they continue to perpetuate it. But again, I do think it's the curve is bending a bit. There's something like that wonderful exhibit on hybrid animals and things, in ancient Egypt and film and everything like that. I mean, that would be something I would say, I would tout and would say would be a real bonus, in terms of hiring. I could be wrong. I don't know. If I were hiring someone, I would think, wow, that is amazing. But again, so I think it is. I think it is starting to get more advantageous. So a lot of it's how you frame it.
And I think that the bit of both advice is good. Balance your popular stuff with the top journals and create a narrative that works for you and shows you off. I think that sounds great.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a really, I think this is a nice positive question from YouTube. Do you think that the arts can influence the way in which archaeologists approach Egyptology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they can, particularly in these kind of what we were just discussing. So these kind of collaborations between artists and of course, museum exhibit is its own kind of art, right? And so you have designers and this kind of thing. So, but also imagery and this sort of thing can you can have these kind of fruitful collaborations. I do think something like a film, though, Moshe makes this point too, that Egyptology in ancient Egypt has such a long history of representation in the West, going all the way back to the Greco-Roman era, and as I said, which still informs a lot of popular perceptions. So a medium like film, especially where the goal is to bring in an audience, it tends to play off of those existing tropes more than shift things. But I think there's a potential there for it to make that transition from kind of these older ideas to something new. And certainly, with something like the language, I mean that from Stargate, that's a good example, and the Mummy movies, of how you can get a kind of value-added aspect to it. And I could see some kind of collaboration centered around that. Not that with apologies, I guess, to the people who did it, but that rather horrible mummy speaking thing, which I just immediately went back to the 19th century and the macabre and all of the tropes that I sort of talked about and that Jasmine Day and other folks have talked about in terms of the mummy theme. It's so much resonates with all of that. But instead, if you want to make the mummy speak, and he was a lector priest, right? So he performs the liturgy in the temple. So why not have a vocalized recording of a part of the temple ritual? I mean, and if you're really concerned about the ah or the ka of this mummy, then they're going to be happier about hearing that than they are about this weird sound that was produced. And I've talked to people who know about the science, and apparently that was a little dubious as well. But it makes it kind of a sideshow, and I think that's the wrong route to go.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, you go.
Well, just something like vocalizing something that he would have said during life, to give you a sense of what a ritual sounded like. I mean, that would be really cool, and it would also be informative, and it would also give people a new appreciation for ancient Egypt. And you can't do a ritual if you don't do the vocalization, because you'll never get the sense of it. Because there's a music to it, and I've done that. I translated a portion of the Litany of Re, which was meant to be performed, and when you add the accent and the pronunciation in it, and you really see the rhythm of it, and it's music, it's song, it's this beautiful thing that you totally don't get if you just do it in the traditional Egyptological way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a fantastic case for getting a professional actor, a professional poet to vocalize it as well, because otherwise you're losing the human element. But I think the mummy vocalization sound, I mean, that to me smacks of where the money goes and what gets funded and what doesn't, and what's valued. But if people would actually pay actors to do this, how amazing would that be? Professionals. We have a question from Augusto, who says, fascinating lecture. It doesn't have to do with sci-fi, but what's your opinion on Shady Abdel Salaam's films?
Unfortunately, I don't really know them, so so I can't really comment. Sorry.
That's okay, Augusto. You should let us know if it's something we should watch and enjoy, and then we'll at least have recommendation.
Exactly. I would be happy to view them if they're available. and
we will add them to the to-watch list that we're creating.
There you go.
Absolutely. Lara, have I missed any questions from Slack? I'm trying to cover all bases.
We're getting quite a few questions about pronunciation and about vocalization, questions about pronunciation of Akhenaten by Philip Glass, for example, and questions about puns and the effect of vocalization in understanding puns from ancient Egypt as well. We're getting quite a lot of questions, and we've already taken so much of your time. So would you like to answer to that one of the puns, for example?
Sure. I'm happy to hang out as long as people want to hang out. I mean, that's another excellent example, puns. You can sort of get at them by looking at the consonantal strings, but by having the vowels, you can reach a much better understanding of them. I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but we would do this sort of thing, with Antonio. He's such a brilliant guy. I mean, the Daniel Jackson character, if I was transported, I would have failed miserably at understanding ancient Egyptian. But I'm sure Antonio, if he was transported like Daniel Jackson, he would have had no problem figuring it out and then speaking Egyptian fluently. Just an amazing guy. But it's really fun to take seminars from him. But that was one of the points that they sort of made, was that you can understand things like punning a lot better. And for Philip Glass, I love Dominic Montserrat's discussion of that production, where he kind of queers it and does all sorts of interesting discussions. I haven't seen it though, unfortunately, but so I'm not sure about the pronunciations. I don't think they're vocalized. I think they're probably a more traditional one. Often what people will do too is they'll do the Egyptological vocalization, but with a kind of Arabic accent. Which is admittedly better than a Western accent, but it's still nowhere near what ancient Egyptian is. And that's kind of what the Tom Cruise mummy was. It was a sort of Arabized pronunciation that was fine, but I was really disappointed when I finally saw the film on a plane, because I wouldn't pay for it because it sounded really bad. And then they came up with the Egyptian lines. I was going, oh, they didn't vocalize. There weren't that many words too. It wouldn't have been that hard to do it. But oh well.
It's a shame. Also, a terrifying movie to watch on a plane.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm surprised they showed it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm super conscious of taking up loads of your time, but I'd like to ask something that I think speaks to the interests of lots of our previous speakers. And one of the things that people have been really interested in across these 2 days is how sci-fi can be used as a tool to teach. And I wanted to know, considering you put so much effort into this, coaching those actors, have you used these films in your teaching? Have you used it as a resource?
That's a great question, and the answer, of course, is yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, they. Although I think someone mentioned that on the first day that when they poll their students, fewer and fewer of them are recognizing even the mummy films. And I've noticed this progression. I'm just starting to notice the mummy films eroding now. I teach a very large introductory course, about 500 students in introductory archaeology. And I talk about it. I talk about, archaeology and film, and of course highlight my own stuff. But it's interesting, when I poll them, there's still quite a few who've seen the mummy movies. So they do have a life. I mean, it helps that all three of these films did really well at the box office and still show up on Netflix or wherever today. Even Stargate the Film, which surprised me because it was made, a long time ago now. There's still maybe a quarter of the students will have seen the actual movie, which is kind of cool. And a few more might have seen some of the TV series spin-offs. But I get students who will come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, I love Stargate," and talk to me about it. So that's fun. But they do make a good jumping off point. So you can explore some of these ideas, especially if you're interested, like I am. And I think many of you attending are interested in a theoretical approach. It allows you to explore some of these tropes like queerness, the gender fluidity, and all these kind of questions. Mummies, that sort of Victorian Gothic, and that idea. Of course, I'm very interested in colonialism, and so that idea of the penetration, again, with this sort of sexual imagery of violation, and that eventually having the periphery collapse back onto the core and causes degeneration, that kind of atavism that is a subplot of a lot of this literature on the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So again, those are all really fascinating things that you can use to help explore some of those ideas. And then on a more just prosaic level, the language itself. So I teach a course on ancient Egyptian religion. And so I include things not just from the movie, but also just other things that I vocalize. And so I have like I mentioned, the Litany of Re, which actually appears briefly in one of the scenes in the movie, but then also the typical, what Egyptologists would say, Hetep di Nisu, which would be something like Hatip di Ensu in vocalized Egyptian, and that kind of thing, and have them, and I lead them in a pronunciation of it so they get a sense of how that worked. I also have them, actually another really good example of how the arts can actually contribute to scholarship is Walter Fairman's wonderful production of the Triumph of Horus from Edfu Temple, and the way he created a play out of it, and it was actually performed a couple of times in England, which is pretty amazing. I would have loved to have seen those original performances because they were done by theater groups, so they had sets and costumes. It was beautiful, at least from the photographs. But I use a somewhat redacted, because it's very long if you do the whole thing, version of that, and have the students recreate it. So I encourage them to make like costumes and do sets, and some of them just have done a brilliant job with sets, and then at the end there's hippo cake for everyone to eat. But it gives you that sense of performativity in ancient Egyptian civilization, and that's one of the things that's really striking about Egyptian religion and theology, is that it's very much performative. So, unlike the typical Western traditions that we think of, Judaism, Christianity, even Islam, even Buddhism, all of these things are traditions that rest on a book. So you have an authoritative text. In Egypt, there was no authoritative text. Everything was potentially fluid, which is often frustrates Western scholars who are trying to find order in a kind of Western logic that does not apply at all to ancient Egyptian theology. But it also was very performative. So the focus was on the temple setting, whether it's the grand temples or whether it's the local shrine or whatever, and the performance of rituals. That's what was, where the religion was centered. And so those kind of performances are a nice way of conveying that, and working that into the classroom setting, particularly on ancient Egypt, specific courses like Egyptian religion, is a really nice way of conveying that.
Fantastic. That's a lovely positive note to end on as well. I'm sure everyone's had the most fantastic time listening to your account, Stuart, of, I can only envy you, your amazing experiences, but also just the fantastic discussion that talk has prompted. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thanks all for coming. I think a conference is only as good as its speakers and its attendees and the questions that are asked. It's been such an amazing couple of days. Thank you again, Stuart, for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Lara to wrap things up for us today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.